The snowstorm was supposed to take everything that night. The road disappeared. The sky closed in. And a lonely cowboy at the edge of Wyoming believed he had finally outrun the world. Then came a knock at his door. An elderly woman, a single suitcase, and a choice that would change two forgotten lives forever. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below, and if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Red Lodge, Montana sat in the crook of the Beartooth Mountains like a town that had learned to keep its head down. In late January, the cold didn't simply arrive. It occupied everything. Porch steps glazed with ice, storefront windows filmed with frost, the air so sharp it made lungs feel borrowed. The streets were narrow ribbons between snowbanks piled to shoulder height, and the wind slid down from the peaks with the steady indifference of something that had been here longer than any name on a mailbox. Daylight came late and left early. At dusk, the sky turned the color of pewter, and the town's lights flickered on one by one as if each bulb were choosing courage. A few miles outside that cautious glow, the plains opened into a quiet stretch of ranchland where fences disappeared under drifted white, and the world seemed reduced to two things: weather and will. Caleb Rowan lived out there on purpose. At 33, Caleb had the look of a man carved by routine and left, unfinished by grief. He stood a touch over 6 feet, lean in a way that wasn't fashionable but functional, the kind of build earned by lifting hay bales, breaking ice in water troughs, and walking into wind without complaining. His face was angular, with a straight nose and cheekbones that caught light like edges of weathered stone. He kept a short beard that darkened his jaw, not out of style so much as practicality. Shaving in winter felt like tempting fate. His hair, the color of burnt walnut, sat perpetually flattened by hat brim and cold, and his eyes were a pale gray blue that made people think of river ice, clear, hard, and quietly dangerous if you didn't respect it. In town, folks remembered him as the Rowan boy who used to laugh loud at rodeos and drink coffee at the diner like it was a social contract. That Caleb had been easy with strangers, quick with a joke, and generous with his time. The current Caleb moved like someone trying not to make a sound. Not unfriendly. Just absent in a way that discouraged questions. The change had not been sudden. It had been a slow retreat after his mother died 2 winters ago, a death that arrived ordinary and merciless, a heart that stopped before any goodbye could be practiced. Caleb had done what many men did when the world asked them to feel in public. He stepped back, then farther, until the space between him and other people started to look like a lifestyle. His ranch house sat at the end of a rutted lane that winter often erased. It was a practical structure, white clapboard, a tin roof that snapped and pinged when the temperature dropped, windows framed with thick trim Caleb had repaired more times than he could count. The place smelled of wood smoke, leather, and faintly of coffee grounds that never quite left the kitchen. Out back were a small barn, a lean-to for tools, and corrals that creaked under the burden of snow. None of it was picturesque in the way tourists liked. It was real. It held up because Caleb did. The only creature he allowed to comment on his life was a border collie named Hank. Hank was old enough that his muzzle had gone gray, but he still carried himself with the solemn authority of a dog who believed the universe required supervision. His coat was black and white, thick against the cold, and his eyes were the sharp brown of someone always keeping score. He walked with a slight stiffness in his back legs, a reminder that time collected interest even on the hard-working. Yet he still had habits that belonged to his younger self, circling the yard each morning as if checking perimeter, nudging Caleb's knee if breakfast was late, and barking precisely once at the mail truck because tradition mattered. Caleb liked Hank because Hank demanded nothing emotional. He needed food, warmth, and purpose. Caleb could provide those without risking the parts of himself that felt fragile. Hank, in turn, provided a kind of companionship that didn't require conversation, just presence, steady and uncomplicated. That particular afternoon, winter pressed down harder than usual. The temperature had been falling since morning, and by late day the air had a strange density to it, as if the sky were holding its breath. Caleb had spent hours outside, mending a section of fence that Wind and Elk had argued with. He worked with gloved hands that still managed precision, tightening wire, driving staples, the repetitive motions soothing in their predictability. Every so often he paused, eyes narrowing toward the mountains where clouds gathered in thick, bruised layers. He knew that look. He'd grown up under it. The Beartooths didn't send polite warnings, they sent storms. Back inside, he peeled off his coat and hung it by the door, steam rising from the fabric like a small surrender. Hank followed, nails clicking on the wood floor. Caleb fed the dog first, as he always did, and watched Hank eat with the earnest intensity of someone who had never wasted a meal. Caleb's phone sat on the counter, and for a moment his gaze snagged on it. There was a time when he called into town, checked in with friends, dropped by the diner, made himself seen. Now the phone was mostly for weather alerts and feed orders. Still, he picked it up and glanced at the screen as if expecting a message that would change everything. Nothing. He set it down. Outside, the first flakes began to fall. At first they were lazy, drifting in the porch light like moths, harmless enough to make a man underestimate them. Caleb made coffee, leaned a shoulder against the counter, and watched through the window. The flakes thickened, then angled. Wind found its voice, sliding around the house and testing the seams. Hank padded to the front door, ears pricked. "What is it?" Caleb asked, though he already felt the shift, the way the air seemed to sharpen, the way silence sometimes gathered before something happened. Hank gave a low huff, not a bark, and stared at the door as if expecting it to explain itself. Caleb set his mug down and walked to the window. The yard was quickly losing detail. Fence lines softened. The barn became a darker shape behind a veil of white. The road, what there was of it, was already filling in. Then, in the cone of porch light, a figure appeared. A person, moving slowly, shoulders hunched against the wind, one hand raised to shield their face. The sight was so unexpected Caleb didn't move for a second, his mind catching like a cold engine. Nobody came out here in weather like this. The mail truck turned around at the county road when snow got serious. Neighbors stayed put. People with sense didn't wander. The figure reached the porch steps and grabbed the railing, steadying themselves. There was a knock, soft, then firmer, as if the hand behind it was polite but running out of time. Hank barked once, sharp and accusing. Caleb opened the door. Cold rushed in, fierce enough to bite, and saw. With it came the stranger, an elderly woman wrapped in layers that looked assembled from necessity rather than style. She was in her late 70s, maybe early 80s. Small, but not frail. Her posture held a stubborn straightness, like she refused to let weather or age claim the last word. Wisps of silver hair escaped from beneath a knitted cap, and her skin was fair and weathered, the kind that had seen summers without sunscreen and winters without complaint. Her cheeks were red with cold, her lips were pale. Her eyes, though. Her eyes were a clear hazel, bright with awareness, not fear. She held a battered canvas suitcase in one gloved hand. Snow crusted the fabric. Her other hand clutched the porch rail as if it were the only stable thing in a shifting world. Caleb stepped back instinctively to make room. "Ma'am?" "I know," she said, voice steady, slightly breathless. "It's a terrible night to be a wanderer. Believe me, I've already given myself a lecture." She managed a thin smile, the kind that showed she still had a sense of humor even when her fingers were probably numb. "I missed the last bus out of town. Thought I could make it to the next place on foot. The storm disagreed." The way she said it, like the storm was an opinionated neighbor, made something in Caleb loosen by a fraction. He didn't smile yet, but his face softened. "Come in," he said, and gestured her inside. "You'll freeze out there." She stepped over the threshold with care, boots heavy and wet. Hank approached her cautiously, head low, sniffing the hem of her coat like a small customs officer. The woman looked down at him with mild approval. "Well, aren't you handsome?" she said, and her tone warmed on that single word. Hank's tail gave one slow wag, betraying his earlier suspicion. Caleb shut the door, locking out the wind. For a moment they stood in the entryway, the woman's breath visible, Caleb's hand still. Half raised as if he wasn't sure what to do next, he realized he hadn't had a guest in months. The house felt suddenly aware of itself, its quiet, its lived-in solitude, the way the silence had become furniture. Name's Evelyn Brooks, the woman said, as if she were checking off a necessary detail. She pushed her cap back a little, revealing more of that silver hair. I'm sorry to impose. I just didn't have many better options. Caleb nodded. Caleb Rowan. Rowan, she repeated, tasting the name like she'd heard it before. You're out a good ways. Yeah, Caleb said. He hesitated, then took the suitcase from her with one hand. It was heavier than he expected. Not just clothes, he thought. A life fits in strange weights. You hurt anywhere? Frostbite? You should warm up. Evelyn flexed her fingers inside her gloves. Nothing that can't be solved by heat and stubbornness. He led her toward the living room where the wood stove sat, its black iron sides radiating a steady warmth. The room was simple: a worn couch, a chair with a patched arm, a coffee table scarred by years of use, boots by the door, a stack of mail on a side table, a faded photograph of his parents on a shelf, his father standing in a hat, his mother smiling like she'd just made a joke no one else heard. Evelyn's gaze flicked to the photo, and something in her expression softened, but she didn't comment. Caleb was grateful for that restraint in a stranger. Sit, he said, pointing to the chair closest to the stove. I'll get you a blanket. You're very efficient, Evelyn observed as she lowered herself carefully into the chair. Like you've been practicing not panicking. Caleb snorted once, almost a laugh, but not quite. Something like that. He returned with a wool blanket and draped it over her shoulders. Up close, he noticed the fine lines around her eyes, not bitter, but earned, like laughter had been a frequent visitor in her life. He also noticed her hands, thin but strong-looking, the knuckles slightly swollen with age, hands that had worked. You said you missed the bus, Caleb said, moving toward the kitchen. Where were you headed? Evelyn adjusted the blanket, her posture relaxing as warmth began to reach her. Truth is, I was headed anywhere I wasn't alone. The words landed quietly, but they carried weight. Caleb paused with his back to her, one hand on the kettle. He felt an old, familiar tightening in his chest, the reflex to step away from something too honest. Behind him, Hank settled on the rug, eyes on Evelyn as if deciding whether she belonged. Caleb filled the kettle and set it on the stove. He didn't ask questions yet. Questions felt like hooks, and he'd lived too long without wanting to be caught. Still, as the wind hammered the house and snow began to thicken against the windows, he realized there was no sending her back out. The road was disappearing by the minute. The world outside had turned into a white mouth, hungry and indifferent. He brought her a mug of coffee, black, strong, the way he drank it. Evelyn took it with both hands, letting the heat sink in. Thank you, she said, and the sincerity in her voice was simple, not dramatic. Caleb nodded. Then, almost against his will, he sat in the chair across from her, keeping a respectful distance, like a man unsure how close is safe. Outside, the storm gathered its full strength. Inside, the room held two people and a dog and a fire that refused to go out. And somewhere in the space between a cowboy who had learned to vanish and an old widow who refused to be erased, the first thread of the story tightened into place. The storm did not peak and pass the way Caleb half expected it to. Instead, it settled in, patient and relentless, as if it had every intention of being remembered. Wind pressed against the walls with a low, continuous force, and snow built itself into the seams of the house, filling the world outside until even the idea of distance disappeared. Red Lodge might as well have been another country. Out here, the ranch existed in its own weather-bound universe, cut loose from roads, schedules, and polite intentions. Inside, the fire held. The wood stove clicked and breathed, its heat steady but modest, like an old friend who didn't overpromise. Evelyn Brooks sat wrapped in the wool blanket, her boots set neatly by the stove as if she'd already decided she would behave like a guest worth keeping. Her coat hung over a chair to dry, dripping meltwater onto the floorboards. She had loosened her cap, revealing hair cut short and practical, once probably brown, now fully surrendered to silver. Her posture had softened, but not collapsed. She carried herself like someone who had learned long ago that dignity was not about strength, but about refusal to give up space. Caleb leaned against the counter with his coffee, watching her from the edge of the room. He wasn't suspicious exactly. He just wasn't practiced at sharing his space anymore. Every object in the house had settled into its place around him. Boots by the door, jacket on the hook, silence filling the rest. Now the silence had shifted, accommodating another breathing rhythm, another presence. It was unsettling in a way he couldn't immediately name. Hank lay on the rug between them, chin on his paws, eyes moving back and forth as if tracking a slow tennis match. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor when Evelyn adjusted the blanket, a sound that carried more approval than enthusiasm. "You live a good distance from town," Evelyn said after a while, her voice calm, conversational, as if they'd known each other long enough to fill silences without fear. "Must take some planning, especially in winter." Caleb nodded. "You learn what you need. Stock up before the snow hits, fix things before they break." He paused, then added, "And accept that sometimes the weather decides for you." Evelyn smiled faintly. "That sounds like something my husband used to say. He was a miner. Believed the mountain always had the last word." Caleb glanced at her, curious now. "Coal?" "Copper mostly," she replied. "Spent his life underground, then came home covered in dust like he'd been carved out of the earth and forgotten to be polished." There was affection in her tone, not sadness. "He used to say the dark taught him patience. I think it just taught him how to listen." That word, listen, hung between them. Caleb took a sip of his coffee to give his hands something to do. Outside, a sharp crack echoed from the barn's direction, wood protesting. Under the weight of snow, Caleb straightened instinctively, eyes flicking to the window. "I should check on the horses," he said, already reaching for his coat. Evelyn looked at him sharply. "In this?" "They'll be fine," he said, though his voice carried a note of obligation rather than certainty. "But I need to make sure." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll keep the fire alive. I'm good at that." Caleb pulled on his coat and boots, the familiar ritual grounding him. Hank was on his feet instantly, tail wagging once with restrained excitement. Outside meant purpose. The cold hit hard as soon as Caleb opened the door, slicing through layers and breath alike. Snow came sideways now, driven by wind that had no patience left. Visibility dropped to a few yards at best. Caleb moved by memory, boots crunching, shoulders leaning into the force. Hank stayed close, his dark shape a constant at Caleb's knee. The barn loomed out of the white, its outline softened, roof heavy with accumulation. Inside, the horses shifted and stamped, aware of the storm, but unconcerned in the way animals often were. Caleb moved among them, checking doors, brushing snow from a latch, murmuring low reassurances. There was Ash, his oldest gelding, a dapple gray with a scar above one eye from a fence incident years back. Ash was steady, unflappable, the kind of horse that trusted Caleb completely and returned that trust in calm obedience. Beside him stood June, a younger mare, chestnut with a white blaze down her face, still restless in bad weather, ears flicking at every sound. Caleb ran a hand down her neck, feeling the warmth beneath her coat. "Easy," he murmured. "It's just noise." He stayed longer than necessary, the physical work anchoring him. When he finally headed back, snow already filled his tracks behind him, erasing evidence of movement as quickly as it was made. Inside the house, warmth rushed him again. Evelyn looked up. From the stove where she was feeding in another log, movements practiced and confident. She had removed her gloves and now wore a simple ring on her left hand, gold dulled by years of wear. "They're fine," Caleb said, hanging his coat. "Just loud out there." Evelyn nodded. "Loud weather has a way of stirring things." She poured him another cup of coffee without asking, a small assumption that surprised him more than it should have. He accepted it with a quiet thanks. Time moved strangely after that. The storm created its own clock, measured in gusts and lulls rather than hours. Evelyn spoke a little more, not pressing, not prying. She told him she had taught elementary school for over 30 years, the kind of teacher who remembered names decades later and corrected grammar gently but firmly. She had outlived most of her family, and when her husband passed 5 years earlier, the house they'd shared had grown too large, too full of echoes. "I thought movement might help," she said simply. "Turns out, weather has opinions about that." Caleb listened. He found that listening didn't drain him the way he'd expected. If anything, it felt like standing still while something heavy was set down nearby, not his burden, but close enough to recognize. At one point, the lights flickered, once, twice, then steadied. Caleb tensed, eyes narrowing at the ceiling. "Generator's ready if it goes," he said, more to himself than to her. Evelyn chuckled softly. Always prepared. Habit, Caleb replied. He didn't add that preparation was how he avoided surprises, and surprises were where grief liked to hide. Later, when the wind rose again and sleep became a distant idea, Caleb showed Evelyn the spare room. It was small, clean, rarely used. Fresh sheets waited in the closet, a habit left over from a version of himself that believed people might visit again someday. She stood in the doorway, suitcase at her feet. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words carried more weight. "For not asking too many questions." Caleb met her gaze. "You're welcome to stay as long as the road's gone," she smiled. "Then, I suppose we'll see what the storm decides." When he returned to the living room, Hank followed, curling up by the couch with a contented sigh. Caleb sat down, the house quieter now, but not empty. The storm continued its work outside, but inside something had shifted. Not resolved, not healed, just occupied. For the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't feel like the night was something to endure. It was simply something that was happening, and he was not alone inside it. Morning arrived without ceremony, as if the night had simply loosened its grip rather than fully retreated. The storm still owned the land, but its voice had lowered from a roar to a tired, resentful murmur. Snow lay everywhere in deep, uneven drifts, sculpted by the wind into ridges that caught pale light. The sky was the dull white of unpolished bone, heavy with clouds that hadn't yet decided whether they were finished. Caleb woke before dawn, as he always did. Habit pulled him from sleep long before comfort could argue. For a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar weight of another presence in the house, he lay still, listening. The stove ticked softly as it cooled. Wind pressed against the walls, gentler now. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked, Evelyn shifting in the spare room perhaps, or the house settling back into itself. He sat up, ran a hand through his hair, and pulled on his jeans and flannel. Hank stirred at the foot of the couch, lifting his head, eyes alert, but calm. The dog's tail thumped once, restrained like he understood that something quiet was happening. "Easy," Caleb murmured. "Just morning." In the kitchen, he poured coffee grounds into the filter, the familiar routine grounding him. Outside the window, the world looked both erased and amplified. Every fence post half buried, every tree bowed under white weight. The road was gone entirely, swallowed so completely it might never have existed. The generator hummed steadily out back, having kicked in sometime before dawn. Caleb made a mental note to check fuel later. Winter never forgave neglect. He was pouring hot water when Evelyn appeared in the doorway. She had changed into clean clothes from her suitcase, dark slacks, a soft blue sweater that brought out the warmth in her eyes. Her hair was brushed back neatly, revealing a face still lined but alert, the skin of her cheeks pale in the morning light. She moved carefully, but not timidly, as if pain and ache were things she acknowledged without letting them steer. "I hope I didn't oversleep," she said. Her voice was lower in the morning, steadier. "You're fine," Caleb replied. "Storm still got us boxed in." She walked to the window, hands clasped loosely in front of her, and let out a soft whistle. "That's thorough." "Montana's nothing if not committed," Caleb said. He handed her a mug. "Coffee?" She took it gratefully. "You're a good host." He shrugged. Compliments slid off him easier than accusations, but neither stayed long. "It's just weather sense." They drank in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't feel strained. Hank wandered in, accepted a brief scratch from Evelyn, then stationed himself near the door like a sentry. Caleb glanced at the clock. "I need to check the stock again. Snow like this can cave in weak roofs." "I'll stay out of the way," Evelyn said, "unless you need help." The offer surprised him. He met her gaze and saw no false politeness there, just readiness. "If you don't mind keeping the radio on," he said. "Sometimes the county puts out updates." She nodded. "Happy to." Outside, the cold was sharper than the night before, the kind that stung exposed skin instantly. Caleb layered up, pulled his hat low, and stepped into the drifted world. Hank bounded ahead, moving with practiced confidence, his dark body carving a path through snow that reached nearly to Caleb's knees. The barn roof sagged slightly under the weight, but held. Caleb worked methodically, clearing snow where he could, checking supports, his muscles burning with effort. Ash greeted him with a low nicker, calm as ever. June was more restless, stamping, blowing warm breath into the cold air. Caleb spoke to them as he worked, the sound of his own voice steadying him. When he finished, he stood for a moment outside the barn, looking toward the invisible line where his land met the Châtillon County Road. Somewhere beyond that white horizon was Red Lodge, people waking up, checking windows, deciding whether to worry. The distance felt both comforting and strange. Back inside, the radio crackled softly. Evelyn sat at the table, notebook open in front of her, pen resting in her hand. She looked up as Caleb came in, snow clinging to his coat. "Anything?" he asked, stripping off his gloves. "Road closures all around," she said. "County says no plows until the wind dies down. They're asking folks to stay put." He nodded. "Figures." She hesitated, then tapped the notebook. "I hope you don't mind. Old habit. I like to write in the mornings." He shook his head. "It's fine." She smiled, then added, "I'm not very good at sitting without doing something. Teaching ruins you that way." Caleb poured himself more coffee and leaned against the counter. "You miss it?" "Every day," she said without drama. "But I don't miss the noise. Just the moment when a child understands something for the first time. That pause before they smile." The image landed quietly. Caleb thought of his mother at the kitchen table years ago, correcting his homework with patient firmness, tapping the page with a pencil. The memory surprised him with its clarity. The lights flickered again, more insistently this time, then went out. The generator stuttered once, twice, and died. Hank barked sharply. Caleb was already moving, heart thudding, calculations snapping into place. He grabbed his coat again. "I'll check it," he said. "Stay warm." Evelyn stood. "I can help." He considered for half a second, then nodded. "Stay by the door." Outside, the generator sat half-buried, its housing rimmed with ice. Caleb cursed under his breath, hands working quickly despite numb fingers. A fuel line had iced over. He cleared it, primed the engine, pulled the cord. Nothing. Again. On the third pull, it coughed to life. Uneven, but running. He stood there for a moment after, breath heavy, snow settling on his shoulders. The storm wasn't done, he realized. It had simply shifted tactics. When he came back in, Evelyn had laid out extra blankets on the couch and lit candles, their small flames steady and bright. The room glowed warmly despite the temporary dimness. "Well," she said lightly, "that's one way to start the day." Caleb exhaled, tension draining. "Good thinking." They ate a simple breakfast, eggs, toast, the last of the bacon. It felt domestic in a way that unsettled him more than the storm had. Evelyn moved easily in the kitchen, asking before she touched anything, but clearly comfortable with the rhythm of shared space. Later, as the morning wore on, they sat by the window, watching the wind redraw the landscape. Evelyn told him more about her husband, Thomas Brooks, a man with broad shoulders and perpetually coal-stained hands, quiet in crowds but unexpectedly funny at home. She spoke of the accident that had taken him. Not sudden, not dramatic, just a lung that finally refused its duty. The way she told it lacked bitterness, but not weight. "He used to say," she added, "that grief was like dust. You don't notice it at first, but it settles everywhere." Caleb absorbed that. He didn't reply right away. When he did, his voice was low. "My mother died in this kitchen. Heart attack, no warning." Evelyn didn't gasp or rush to fill the space. She simply nodded. "I'm sorry." The words were plain, but they landed right. By midday, the storm began to thin, light seeping through clouds in hesitant patches. The wind eased, though the cold remained. They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. The house felt occupied in a way that didn't threaten him. It held their shared quiet without strain. Outside, snow continued to fall, softer now, like an afterthought. Inside, Caleb realized something had shifted. Not dramatically, not permanently, but enough to be noticed. The night had not only passed, it had stayed long enough to leave a mark. By the third morning, the storm finally loosened its grip enough to reveal edges again. Not freedom, just definition. The sky broke into uneven slabs of gray and pale blue, and light spilled across the snow in cold, honest bands. Drifts still ruled the land, but the wind had calmed to a low whisper, as if it were tired of arguing. The world looked bruised but intact, like something that had survived on stubbornness alone. Caleb stood on the porch with a mug of coffee warming his hands, studying the road, or rather where the road should have been. A faint depression curved through the white, a suggestion more than a promise. He could see fence posts again, their dark tops poking out like cautious thoughts. The ranch no longer felt sealed off from existence, but it wasn't welcoming anyone in either. Behind him, the door creaked softly. Evelyn stepped out, wrapped in her coat, scarf tucked neatly at her throat. The cold had not chased her back inside. She stood beside him, leaving a careful space between their shoulders, the way people did when they respected both proximity and boundary. "Well," she said, surveying the view, "that's progress. I can almost imagine a road under all that." Caleb nodded. "County plow will get here eventually. Might be today, might be tomorrow." She smiled. "I've learned not to rush the mountain." Hank lay at their feet, chin on his paws, watching the distance with professional interest. His age showed more clearly in the daylight, stiffness in his hips when he shifted, the whitening fur around his eyes, but there was still alert intelligence there, a dog who had adapted rather than surrendered. After breakfast, Caleb set to work digging out the gate near the far fence. It was slow, punishing labor, the kind that turned breath into steam and shoulders into protest. Evelyn insisted on helping, despite his initial resistance. She didn't lift snow so much as manage the space, clearing smaller drifts, brushing off fence rails, steadying herself with quiet determination. She moved like someone who understood her limits and refused to be embarrassed by them. "You don't have to," Caleb began. "I know," she said simply, pausing to catch her breath. "But I want to." That ended the discussion. By midday, the work yielded results. The gate emerged, recognizable and functional. Beyond it, the road's shape became clearer, pressed down by wind and faint tracks from wildlife. Caleb straightened, wiping his brow with a gloved hand. "That'll do for now," he said. Evelyn leaned on her shovel, cheeks flushed from exertion. "Feels good," she said, "to make something visible again." He glanced at her, understanding more than she'd said. They were inside again when the radio crackled to life with a sharper tone than before. Caleb turned it up, brow furrowing. A male voice cut through the static, calm, practiced. "This is Deputy Mark Halverson, with Carbon County. We've got limited access restored on County Road 12. If you're stranded and need assistance, respond." Caleb reached for the mic without hesitation. "This is Rowan Ranch, mile marker 14. 2 people here. No injuries. Generators running. Road still blocked near the gate." There was a pause. Then the voice returned. "Copy that, Rowan. We'll try to reach you before nightfall if conditions hold." Evelyn listened quietly, arms folded loosely. When Caleb set the mic down, she said, "You're known." He shrugged. "Hard to disappear completely." She studied him, then nodded. "Maybe that's not a bad thing." The afternoon stretched on, gentler than the days before. The house returned to its rhythms, wood added to the stove, dishes washed, boots drying by the door. Evelyn asked if she could help with lunch and surprised Caleb by producing a decent stew from limited supplies. She worked efficiently, sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back with a simple clip. "My mother used to cook like that," Caleb said without thinking, like she was solving a problem. Evelyn smiled. "Feeding people is a form of problem solving." They ate at the table, the space between them smaller now, less guarded. Conversation drifted easily, from books Evelyn loved to the way Red Lodge had changed over the years. She spoke of storefronts that had vanished, of children who grew up and moved away, of the town's quiet resilience. In the late afternoon, Caleb saddled Ash. The sky had cleared enough to risk a short ride to check the back pasture. He hesitated at the barn door, then turned to Evelyn. "I'll be an hour," he said. "Road's still rough." "I'll be right here," she replied, with a steadiness that felt like a promise rather than an obligation. The ride cleared something in him. Ash moved with familiar assurance, hooves breaking crusted snow, breath steady. From the rise overlooking the Cosote pasture, Caleb could see the ranch laid out below him, scarred but standing. Smoke curled from the house's chimney, a small human signal against a wide, indifferent landscape. When he returned, the sun was already lowering, painting the snow in long shadows. Evelyn stood at the window, watching him approach. She opened the door before he reached it, a small act that struck him harder than expected. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "Looks good." As evening settled, the radio crackled again. Deputy Halverson's voice returned, clearer this time. "Rowan Ranch, this is Halverson. Plow's clearing your stretch now. You should have access within the hour." Caleb exhaled slowly. "Copy that. Appreciate it." He turned to Evelyn. The moment hung between them, unspoken but heavy. The storm had brought her here. The road would take her away. She broke the silence first. "I suppose this is where I thank you again." He nodded. "You're welcome to stay the night. Roads might refreeze." She considered, then shook her head gently. "I think I should go while I can, but—" She paused, eyes searching his face. "I don't think this is the kind of place you forget." Neither was she, he realized. They packed her things together. When the plow finally passed, its lights cutting through dusk like a brief ceremony, Caleb walked her to the porch. The cold had returned, but it no longer felt hostile, just present. Evelyn turned to him, one gloved hand resting on the railing. "You know," she said, "staying doesn't always mean being trapped." Caleb met her gaze, something steady in his chest. "And leaving doesn't always mean running." She smiled at that, a full, warm expression. Then she stepped down the porch and toward the waiting road. Caleb watched until the vehicle disappeared, until the sound of it faded completely. Then he went back inside, the house quieter. But it emptied tinted. The road had reappeared, and with it, the knowledge that connection didn't vanish just because someone did. The house did not feel empty after Evelyn left. That was the strangest part. Caleb noticed it the moment the door closed behind him and the latch settled into place with its familiar click. The quiet returned, yes, but it was a changed quiet, rearranged by recent memory. Like furniture moved slightly out of habit, the silence now carried the imprint of conversation, of cups left to dry, of a chair that had been occupied and would remember the weight. Caleb stood in the entryway longer than necessary, hat still in his hands, boots damp at the soles. Outside, the road lay open at last, narrow and raw, scraped down to packed snow by the county plow. Tracks cut through it, evidence of motion, of departure. The sky had shifted again, pale and wide, the mountains back in view like nothing had happened. Hank padded past him and sniffed at the place where Evelyn's suitcase had rested. The dog tilted his head, ears lifting, as if waiting for the door to open again and complete a pattern. His mind had already accepted. "She's gone," Caleb said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. Hank huffed once and wandered toward the living room, apparently deciding that disappearance was not the same as loss. Caleb moved through the house, picking up the small signs she had left behind, a folded blanket on the chair, a mug washed and set carefully upside down on the towel. On the kitchen table, he found the notebook she'd been writing in, not forgotten, but intentionally left. It was open to a single page, blank except for one line written neatly across the top. "Thank you for staying." He closed the notebook and set it by the shelf, unsure yet whether he would read more later or let it be. The days that followed were quieter, but not in the same way as before. Caleb returned to his routines, feeding the horses, repairing storm damage, hauling broken branches from the far fence, yet each task felt slightly altered, as if it now existed in relation to something else. He found himself cooking more than necessary, making meals that could have fed two. He caught himself listening for footsteps that weren't there. On the third day after the road reopened, Caleb drove into Red Lodge. It wasn't a dramatic decision. He didn't wake up resolved to rejoin the world. He simply realized he was out of grain and low on fuel, and the road was passable. Still, as he steered the truck down the familiar stretch toward town, his shoulders stayed tight, hands firm on the wheel. Red Lodge greeted him cautiously. Snowbanks lined the streets, but storefronts were open again, lights glowing against the cold. The diner's windows were fogged with warmth. People moved slower than usual, boots crunching, conversations held close. The town looked the way it always did after weather tested it, bruised, functional, quietly proud. Caleb parked near the feed store and stepped out, pulling his coat tighter. A few heads turned. Recognition traveled quickly in. Small towns. "Caleb Rowan!" a voice called. He turned to see Ben Mercer crossing the street toward him. Ben was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, with a beard that never seemed to grow in evenly but was kept anyway out of stubborn preference. His hair was already thinning, windburn etched permanently into his cheeks. He owned the hardware store and wore concern like a second jacket, always ready, never ornamental. "Didn't think I'd see you out so soon," Ben said, offering a gloved hand. "Heard you were snowed in good." Caleb shook it. "We managed." Ben raised an eyebrow. "We?" Caleb hesitated only a fraction. "Had a guest." Ben nodded slowly, absorbing that. "Storm brings folks together," he said. "Sometimes whether they like it or not." They stood there a moment longer than necessary. Ben glanced toward the diner. "You grabbing lunch?" "Just supplies," Caleb replied. "Well," Ben said, clapping his hands together, "if you need anything at all, you know where to find me." Caleb nodded. "Thanks." Inside the feed store, the smell of grain and oil wrapped around him like a memory. He loaded what he needed efficiently, exchanged brief words with the clerk, a young woman with tired eyes and a grateful smile. No one pressed him. That, too, felt different. On his way out, he passed the small public library. The lights were on. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, he slowed. Through the window, he saw a woman shelving books, movements precise and unhurried. She was in her early 30s, perhaps, with dark hair pulled back in a low ponytail, glasses perched on her nose. She wore a soft sweater and moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to order. The door opened, and she stepped out into the cold, nearly colliding with him. "Oh, sorry," she said quickly, stepping back. Her voice was warm, apologetic. "No, that's on me," Caleb replied. She smiled, adjusting her glasses. Up close, he noticed her eyes were a deep brown, observant without being intrusive. "You're Caleb Rowan, right?" He nodded, surprised. "Yeah." "I'm Lila Monroe," she said. "Library." She gestured vaguely behind her. "Evelyn used to volunteer with us when she was in town." The name landed softly but firmly. "She mentioned you," Lila continued. "Said you had a good house for storms." Caleb felt something ease in his chest. "She okay?" Lila nodded. "She called yesterday. Said she made it back to Billings. Told me to tell you thank you if I saw you." He managed a small smile. "I appreciate that." They stood there, breath visible in the cold. Lila seemed unhurried, comfortable with pauses. "Well," she said finally, "if you ever need anything to read out there, you know where we are." He nodded. "I might take you up on that." Back at the ranch, the light was already thinning. Caleb unloaded the truck, Hank supervising closely. The horses greeted him with familiar sounds, Ash calm as ever, June snorting impatiently. Life resumed its shape, but it felt subtly expanded, like a room with one wall pushed back. That evening, Caleb cooked stew again, this time deliberately. He set 2 bowls out of habit, then paused, smiled faintly, and put one away. He ate slowly, thinking of Evelyn, of the way she'd said staying didn't always mean being trapped. After dinner, he sat at the table and pulled the notebook toward him. He opened it, not to her writing, but to a blank page. He hesitated, pen hovering, then began to write. Not a letter, not a confession, just observations, weather, horses. A woman who'd passed through and left something behind without asking for anything in return. Outside, the night settled gently, no longer hostile. The road lay quiet but present. The world felt larger than it had a week ago, and Caleb, for the first time in a long while, felt capable of standing in it without shrinking. Winter loosened its grip reluctantly, the way it always did in Montana, never surrendering all at once, never apologizing for the damage done. The days grew longer, by minutes rather than hours. Snow retreated in uneven patches, exposing dark soil, flattened grass, and fence lines bent but unbroken. The air still carried cold, but it no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a test that had mostly been passed. Caleb noticed the change not by temperature, but by sound. Birds returned first, sharp, argumentative things that made themselves known before dawn. Then the creek beyond the far pasture began to speak again, ice cracking, water moving underneath. Life, impatient and stubborn, resumed its conversations. With it came invitations. They arrived quietly at first, a wave from a passing truck, Ben Mercer stopping by the ranch with a box of bolts Caleb hadn't asked for but would eventually need. A note tucked into the feed order invoice. Library's got new arrivals. LM. Caleb read it twice before folding it carefully and slipping it into his pocket. He told himself he didn't owe the town anything. And yet, one Thursday morning, he found himself shaving more carefully than usual, trimming his beard so it no longer looked like a statement. He put on a clean flannel and drove into Red Lodge without a specific errand. The town met him halfway. The diner door chimed as he stepped inside, releasing a wave of warmth and sound. Plates clinked, coffee steamed, conversation layered itself into a low, steady hum. It smelled like bacon grease and familiarity. A woman behind the counter looked up and smiled. Sarah Whitcomb had worked there for as long as Caleb could remember. She was in her late 50s now, sturdy and unpretentious, with graying blonde hair pulled back in a loose bun and laugh lines that deepened when she smiled, which was often. Her presence carried the comfortable authority of someone who had seen people at their worst hours and fed them anyway. "Well, look who thawed out," she said. "Sit, you look like you need coffee." Caleb slid into a booth near the window, the vinyl cold through his jeans. "Morning, Sarah." She poured without asking. "Storm treat you okay?" "It did," he said. "Eventually." She nodded, reading more into that than he said, and moved on without pushing. A man approached his table then, tall and broad, shoulders slightly hunched as if he'd learned to make himself smaller around people. Ethan Cole, early 30s, clean-shaven except for a perpetually shadowed jaw, dark hair cropped short. He worked road maintenance for the county, quiet, efficient, known more for showing up than for talking. A logging accident years ago had left him with a slight limp and a habit of watching everything twice. "Mind if I sit?" Ethan asked. Caleb gestured to the seat across from him. "Go ahead." They talked about the storm, about the roads, about nothing in particular. It wasn't bonding. It was coexistence. And that felt like progress. After breakfast, Caleb walked the length of Main Street. The hardware store, the post office, the library. Inside, the library smelled of paper and dust and something faintly floral. Lila Monroe stood at the front desk, cardigan draped loosely over her shoulders, dark hair still pulled back, though a few strands had escaped. She looked up when the door opened and smiled, not surprised, but pleased. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Caleb replied, suddenly aware of the size of his hands, the way he stood too square in small rooms. She gestured to a stack of books. "I set some aside. Evelyn thought you might like history, and one novel she loved." He glanced at the titles. She had good taste. "She did?" Lila said softly, then more lightly. "You should come to the reading on Saturday. Kids thing. Town tradition." Caleb hesitated. Old instinct urged retreat. New instinct, unfamiliar but persistent, kept him there. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's a start," Lila replied, smiling. Back at the ranch, work waited. It always did. Caleb saddled June this time, deciding it was past time she learned patience from motion. She tossed her head as he mounted, energy still raw, youth resisting discipline. He rode her slow and steady along the fence line, correcting gently, letting her burn off nervousness without punishment. Ash followed along the pasture edge, unhaltered, choosing companionship over independence. Hank trotted behind, tongue lolling, content with the day's assignment. By late afternoon, clouds gathered again, not storm clouds, just the heavy gray of lingering winter. Caleb dismounted and leaned against the fence, watching his animals move through the land like they belonged to it more honestly than he ever had. He thought of Evelyn, of her words, of how she had arrived without demand and left without regret. He wondered if that was the trick, passing through without trying to claim ownership of anything except the moment itself. Saturday came whether he planned for it or not. Caleb stood at the edge of the community hall, hands in his pockets, boots clean but worn. The room buzzed with energy, children sitting cross-legged on the floor, parents lining the walls, volunteers passing out cookies. Lila stood at the front with a book in her hands, voice calm, expressive. She caught sight of him and smiled, not waving, not calling attention, just acknowledging. He stayed. He listened as children laughed at the wrong parts, gasped at predictable moments, asked questions that wandered far from the text. He found himself smiling, then laughing quietly. When it ended, applause filled the room, not polite but genuine. On his way out, Sarah Whitcomb clapped him on the shoulder. "Good to see you," she said, meaning it. Outside, dusk settled like a held breath. Caleb stood on the steps, watching people disperse, their voices fading into the cold. Lila stepped out beside him. "Thanks for coming." "Thanks for inviting me," he said. And he meant it. They stood there, neither rushing away, not lingering for effect, just standing. The town didn't ask him to be anything he wasn't. It didn't demand explanations or apologies. It simply made space. That night, back at the ranch, Caleb lit the lamp and opened Evelyn's notebook again. He added a new line beneath her words. "Stayed." He closed it, satisfied. Outside, the land rested. Inside, the house held him, not as a refuge, but as a place from which he could leave and return. Spring did not arrive with celebration. It slipped in quietly, almost apologetically, as if unsure it would be welcomed. Snow retreated into the shadows, lingering along fence lines and north-facing slopes, but the ground beneath softened and breathed again. Mud replaced ice. The air smelled darker, richer, earth waking up after a long, unwilling sleep. For the first time in months, the wind no longer felt like a challenge. It felt like movement. Caleb noticed the change the morning he forgot his gloves. He stepped out of the house before dawn, coffee steaming in his hand, and realized halfway across the porch that the cold no longer bit. It rested against his skin instead, cool but reasonable. He smiled faintly at the mistake and kept going. Hank followed, slower now, his age more evident in the mornings, joints stiff until warmth worked its way in. The dog's black and white coat had dulled slightly over the years, but his eyes remained sharp, assessing the world with quiet loyalty. Beyond the porch, the gate stood open. Not wide, just enough to matter. Caleb stopped. He knew he'd latched it the night before, habit, drilled deep. The gate was not broken. The chain hung loose, swaying slightly in the breeze. No tracks suggested trouble, no signs of intrusion, just an open gate where there should have been a closed one. He stared at it longer than necessary, a strange tension threading through him. Then he exhaled and walked forward, closing it carefully, fingers lingering on the cold metal. Later, as the sun rose, he saddled Ash and rode the perimeter. The land responded differently now. Hooves sank slightly instead of skidding. The creek ran full and audible, confident in its return. Birds lifted from brush as he passed, unconcerned by his presence. Ash moved with his usual steady assurance, ears flicking, gait smooth, the scar above his eye catching the new light. At the far end of the property, Caleb spotted a truck pulled off near the fence line. He reined in, posture tightening instinctively, then relaxed when the door opened and a man stepped out, lifting one hand in greeting. Jonah Price was hard to miss, mid-40s, tall but narrow-shouldered, with a beard gone mostly gray despite his age, and eyes that carried both humor and apology. He wore a weathered denim jacket and leaned heavily on his left leg, the result of a rodeo injury years back that had ended his competitive days abruptly. Jonah owned the neighboring ranch to the east, smaller, less prosperous, but fiercely maintained. "Morning," Jonah called. His voice was warm, worn by wind and years of talking over engines. Caleb dismounted and walked toward the fence. "Didn't expect company," Jonah smiled. "Fence line's been bothering me. Thought I'd check it before the cattle got any ideas." They walked together, inspecting posts, discussing repairs in the shorthand of men who had done this their whole lives. Jonah worked carefully, favoring his injured leg without comment. His hands were broad but precise, movements economical, the kind of man who had learned patience the hard way. "I heard you had a visitor during the storm," Jonah said casually. Caleb glanced at him. "Word travels." Jonah shrugged. "Small town, big weather." He hesitated, then added, "Good thing, though. No one should ride that out alone." The comment lingered, unchallenged. By midday, the fence was secured. Jonah wiped his hands on his jeans. "There's a branding coming up next week," he said. "Few folks short-handed. Thought I'd ask." Old Caleb would have declined without thought. Work was safer alone. New Caleb considered the open gate from that morning. "I'll be there," he said. Jonah smiled, not surprised. "Good." That afternoon, Caleb drove into town again. Not for supplies this time, but because Lila Monroe had asked him to help move donated books into the community hall. He found her there, Already, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back more loosely than usual, a faint smudge of dust on her cheek she hadn't noticed. "Careful," she said as he lifted a box. "That one's heavier than it looks." "So am I," he replied, and she laughed, an easy sound that startled him with how naturally it landed. They worked side by side for an hour, conversation drifting from favorite authors to the odd things people left tucked into donated books. Lila spoke with her hands when she was animated, fingers tracing shapes in the air, her face expressive but controlled. She had grown up in Red Lodge, left briefly for college, then returned, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she wanted to be where she was known. "You don't get lost here," she said, "even when you want to." Caleb nodded. "That used to bother me." "And now?" He thought of Evelyn, of the notebook, of the open gate. "Now I'm not so sure." Later that evening, back at the ranch, Caleb left the gate unlatched on purpose, not careless, intentional. He stood by the fence as the light faded, listening to the land settle. The horses grazed calmly. June had matured noticeably, her movements less erratic, her trust more apparent. Ash stood near the barn, watching Caleb with the mild patience of age. Hank lay nearby, chin on his paws, content. As dusk deepened, headlights appeared on the road. A familiar sedan pulled up slowly. Caleb didn't move. He knew who it would be before the door opened. Evelyn Brooks stepped out carefully, leaning on a cane this time, her posture still upright but her movements slower. She wore a long coat and a scarf the color of autumn leaves. Her silver hair was neatly styled, her face lined but bright. "Well," she called, smiling, "you left the gate open." Caleb walked toward her, heart steady. "Figured it was time." She laughed softly. "Good answer." They sat on the porch as night fell, coffee warming. Their hands. Evelyn looked healthier than she had during the storm, color in her cheeks, strength in her voice. "I wanted to see how you were," she said. "And to return something." She handed him the notebook. He took it carefully. "You didn't need to." "I know," she replied, "but I wanted to." They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. No urgency, no speeches. When she finally stood to leave, Evelyn placed a hand briefly on his arm. "You stayed," she said. "That's how it starts." After she drove away, Caleb remained on the porch long after the sound faded. The gate stayed open through the night. The day of the branding arrived under a sky that had finally decided to be generous. Blue stretched wide and uninterrupted, the kind of color that made people lift their heads without realizing it. Spring had settled into the land with quiet confidence. Grass pushed through thawed soil. The air smelled of damp earth and warming pine. Nothing felt rushed, nothing felt withheld. Caleb rose early, the habit unchanged, but the feeling was different. Purpose no longer meant isolation, it meant preparation. He moved through the morning with practiced efficiency, coffee poured, tack checked, boots laced. Hank followed him from room to room, slower now, his muzzle almost fully white, but his eyes still alert. At 11 years old, Hank had learned the difference between days that mattered and days that merely passed. This was one of the first kind. "You'll stay here," Caleb told him gently, kneeling to rub the dog's neck. "Too much chaos for you." Hank huffed, offended into principle, but accepting in fact, and settled near the door where he could monitor the world through the window. At Jonah Price's ranch, trucks already lined the dirt road, dust rising in soft clouds as people gathered. The air buzzed with sound, voices calling out, gates clanging, cattle lowing in confusion. Branding was never gentle, but it was necessary, and it was communal. No one did it alone. Caleb tied Ash near the fence and scanned the crowd. Men and women of all ages moved with familiarity born of repetition. There was Ben Mercer, sleeves rolled up, beard braided loosely to keep it out of the way. Ethan Cole leaned against a post, weight shifted to favor his injured leg, eyes sharp and attentive. A few younger hands joked loudly, masking nerves with bravado. Jonah approached, hat pushed back, sweat already darkening the collar of his shirt. "Glad you came," he said simply. "Me too," Caleb replied, surprised to find he meant it without qualification. They worked. In rhythm. Rope, hold, brand, release. Caleb's movements were steady, efficient, his timing precise. June, tied nearby, watched with ears pricked, absorbing everything. Ash stood calm as stone, unbothered by the noise. Caleb felt the old familiarity return, not the reckless confidence of youth, but something deeper. Experience without bitterness, strength without hurry. At midday, the work paused. Coolers opened. Food appeared as if by magic. People sat in the grass, leaning against trucks, sharing stories that wandered and overlapped. Laughter cut through the heat. Caleb found himself beside Lila Monroe, who had arrived with a tray of sandwiches and a book tucked under her arm out of habit rather than need. She wore jeans and boots today, hair braided loosely down her back, face flushed from the sun. "I didn't picture you as a branding type," she said, handing him a sandwich. "Used to be," he replied. "Stopped for a while." "And now?" "Now I remembered." She studied him for a moment, then smiled. "You wear it well." Later that afternoon, as the last calf was released and the crowd began to thin, an older truck pulled in slowly. Caleb recognized it immediately. Evelyn Brooks stepped out, moving carefully, cane in hand. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses, her posture still proud, her presence unmistakable. A murmur moved through the group, not surprise but recognition. She was known here. "Well," Jonah said, approaching her with a grin, "if this isn't a sight." Evelyn smiled. "I heard there'd be good company." Caleb walked toward her, heart steady. "You shouldn't be standing this long." She waved him off. "I didn't come to sit." They watched the last of the cattle wander back into the pasture. The work was done. The land looked settled again. "You stayed," Evelyn said quietly, not as praise, but as observation. "So did you," Caleb replied. She nodded. "I won't always." The words were gentle, but they carried truth. Caleb felt them settle without resistance. That evening, back at the ranch, Caleb lit the fire despite the mild air. Old habits lingered, and warmth was something he associated with reflection. Lila joined him for dinner, having been invited without ceremony and accepted without hesitation. They cooked together, nothing elaborate, just simple food made carefully. Conversation flowed easily, pauses comfortable. As night settled, headlights appeared on the road once more. This time, there was no tension in Caleb's chest when he recognized the car. Evelyn came in quietly, settling into the chair by the fire. She looked tired now, more than she had earlier, the day having taken its toll. "I wanted to see the house one more time," she said. They sat together, the three of them, Caleb, Lila, Evelyn, while the fire spoke softly. Hank lifted his head, walked over, and rested it against Evelyn's knee. She smiled, stroking his fur. "Good dog," she murmured. Later, when Lila left and the house grew still, Evelyn asked Caleb to sit with her. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice calm, certain. "But I don't want to be alone when the quiet comes." Caleb sat. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Evelyn passed later that night, peacefully, the fire still glowing, Hank asleep at her feet. There was no struggle, no urgency, just an ending that felt like completion rather than loss. Spring arrived fully the next morning. The town came when they heard. They filled the house with food, with stories, with presents. Evelyn was laid to rest beneath the cottonwood she loved, the land green around her at last. Caleb stood at the edge of it all, not apart, not overwhelmed, just present. Weeks passed, summer followed. Lila's visits became routine. The gate remained open. Children came by the ranch on school outings. Caleb taught them how to approach a horse, how to listen, before touching. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the plains glowed gold, Caleb stood on the porch with Lila beside him. Hank slept nearby, dreaming. "I used to think staying meant being stuck," Caleb said. Lila looked at him. "And now?" "Now I know it means choosing," she smiled, leaning into him. The house at the end of the road no longer felt like an edge. It felt like a beginning. Sometimes God does not arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes his miracles come quietly, through a stranger at your door, through a moment you almost closed your heart, through the strength to stay when running away feels easier. This cowboy believed he was forgotten, but God never forgets his children. He simply waits for the right moment to remind them they are not alone. If you are watching this today, feeling tired, lonely, or unseen, remember this: the same God who brought light into that snowy night is still working in your life, often in ways you cannot yet see. Every day we pass people who carry silent battles. Every day we have a choice: to close the door, or to open it just a little wider. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story meant to you or where you are watching from. We read every single one. And if you believe in kindness, second chances, and God's quiet miracles, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this. May God bless you, protect you, and bring peace to your home. May He watch over your loved ones, your children, and every animal who depends on human kindness. And may you never forget, even in the coldest seasons of life, God is still writing your story. Amen.